Hello and welcome to another study in the book of Joshua. I hope that you are prepared to hang on a little bit in this particular session. This is our 17th in the book of Joshua. We're going to grab hold of a big chunk of scripture. We're going to be talking about the inheritance divided. And this is just going to be part one, and you'll see why. We're going to go from chapters 15 to 21. Now, we're not going to look at all of that. We're going to look at bits and pieces because what you have is a lot of property lines and borders and cities and suburbs. And then you'll have some intermittent, interesting stories or little nuggets that you can find. And that's kind of what we're going to get into. It might be that there's just a verse or two, but you will look at it and you will find out about some battles fought and won. You'll find out about some heroic romantic conquests ending in marriage. You can read about a lack of battles, which end in a lot of trouble. You can learn a little bit about profiteering from politics. Women's rights is in there. Government and how it can be impartial. How that an inheritance becomes a double portion, and then a grand inheritance and the gift of an inheritance, the gift of land and cities to the priesthood, and then even Joshua's final words. And then, of course, that's beyond where we're going to be looking, but that's coming up in the last and final chapters that are there. But it begins with the tribe of Judah. And so we're going to kind of get started there, and we're not going to be looking at all of the borders and the land. We're going to hit those real quickly, but we're going to be talking a little bit at least about the lot that's being cast. And there's always kind of two lots here. There's the lot of order, which tribe gets to come in order, and not all the tribes are together at first. So you will have a few tribes here and then 7 tribes later. And what they do is cast a lot to determine who's first. But some are already kind of predetermined. We'll look at that. And then on the last ones, the lot was cast and it fell upon Zebulun, Issachar, whatever that's there. And that's what you have from verse or chapter 15 all the way to chapter 21. So if you hang on with me just a minute, we've already seen where Judah had their property lines. Now you see the children of Joseph, which becomes 2 tribes, kind of taking the place of, in a way, Levi as far as the land is concerned, why you get 12 still. And one takes the place of Joseph. But then they have their Manasseh and Ephraim, you have their borders, their land. Then in chapter 17, you see again Manasseh, and you see him getting a double portion for Joseph. And then something interesting, when you get to chapter 18, we find that all of the tribes are going to gather together at Shiloh. Now, you had those first few with Judah, Manasseh, Ephraim, or Joseph, if you will. And then we have all the rest of the tribes meeting at Shiloh. And that's in the land that's going to become part of Ephraim's inheritance. And so it says, and Joshua cast lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord. And there Joshua divided the land unto the children of Israel according to their divisions. So you read a little bit more, and what do we find? And the lot of the tribe of the children of Benjamin came up. So he comes up in this section being first according to the families and the coasts and so on. And then all of a sudden we see in the second lot, chapter 19, came forth to Simeon. Now in chapter 19 is where you're going to have the host of the rest of the lots being cast and who gets. So the second lot is in 19 and 1. And then you have 19 and 10, the third lot. It goes to the children of Zebulun. And you can see to your right there, the map, and it should focus in on the tribe in particular. I didn't want to make it so big you don't see the surrounding areas, but you can get a little bit of an idea of their borders with the other tribes. In chapter 19 and verse 17, you have Issachar and their particular land, their borders. And then in chapter 19, verse 24, the fifth lot and the tribe of Asher. And then in chapter 32, we have the sixth lot and the children of Naphtali. And then in chapter 19, verse 40, I'll get this right so I don't mess you up. The seventh lot came out for the tribe of the children of Dan according to their families. That takes care of all of the tribes, but then you find it very interesting where it says when they made an end of dividing the land, this is in verse 49, the land of inheritance by their coast, the children of Israel gave an inheritance to Joshua, the son of Nun, among them. And you're going to see that this takes place here in Ephraim as well when we look at that, but they gave that to him because of his leadership. Same way, but why did Joseph get a double portion? Why did he have two sons that got portions equal as a tribe? It's because they respected what Joseph had done for them and how that they were alive because of what Joseph did in helping Israel. Then we see in chapter 20, in verses 1 through 2, where the Lord speaks to them and tells them that, listen, I want you to appoint cities of refuge. And if you look on your map to your right, you'll see various stars that are there. Again, I'm not going to go through that just yet because it'll be a wonderful study when we do get there. But we'll see about the cities of refuge. So that part is taking place. And then also the children of Levi, which is Aaron and Moses' tribe as well, but they now don't have an inheritance. So the children of Israel from their own cities, it's kind of like giving a tithe. They gave a portion to the priesthood and gave them cities and suburbs for them to live in. Then we have also chapter 21 and verse 43. Now we've got it all going towards the end. And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land. And this is where really we're getting to with this. I want you to see it. We've got all the land divided. He gave everything unto Israel which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about, according to all that he sware unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. There failed not aught of, let me get to that verse. There failed not of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass. Now, those last three verses I wanted to hit and read in particular because this is God's part. Now, again, we want to kind of go back a little bit, look at the inheritance of Israel, but we want to be reminded nothing that God had promised them failed. We're going to grab all of these verses, and here's the other part of going through the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua doesn't stand alone. You have to remember the history, the full history of Israel. And I think somewhere along the line, you can pick up the story in 2 Chronicles at the very end of the book where God says, I'm done with you. I'm going to drive you out of that land. That's the history we kind of want to keep in the back of our mind and learn a little bit about. So if you remember again, we're talking about all this inheritance. The children of Judah get their inheritance. And there's a wonderful story about Caleb and his portion that again is there, and he takes all of the land. Of course, and remember that Caleb's lot was predetermined. That's in verse 13 of chapter 15. But then as you read through this very long chapter, all of a sudden you get to verse 63. And what do we read? As for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Now, if we pay attention to this, we're going to see in this inheritance, right at the very beginning, that Israel lost an opportunity. And I'm going to show you there are a couple of other companion scriptures with a couple of other tribes having to do with not only the Jebusites, but now the Canaanites. Let's look at chapter 16 and verse 10, where here we're talking about another tribe, but a group, the Canaanites were the enemies, and they were commanded by God to drive them out. And yet it says, and they drave not out, or the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell among the Ephraimites unto this day and serve under tribute. Hang on to that as well, that little tidbit. But again, notice they didn't drive them out. We find the same thing happening in chapter 17 and verse 12, where we find with the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. Now, what's interesting about this is we see the same pattern. They couldn't drive them out. In one case, it says they are made tribute, but there's something lacking. So when we look at this whole storyline, what I want to see is that particular question. What was lacking? What was the problem with Israel? I consider sometimes in my research of the Bible of being like a biblical forensic scientist. I want to dig in and discover the things that are not easily and readily understood. Sometimes they're not going to be. There is no answer. But I really did want to look a little bit more and discover the reason of why, and I thought it could be profitable. Why didn't these tribes drive out the Jebusites and the Canaanites that lived in their land? Remember, we're talking about Jerusalem. They had already captured that city. They had already killed that king. So now they're allowing them to live. Was it because they lacked a desire to get rid of them? I think there is a part of that that's true, but I don't think that's the real reason. Was there a problem with power? You kind of get a picture of that somehow or another, the enemy was too strong. They couldn't get rid of them. But then you think, well, God is their power. So did they really lack power? Well, then maybe it was faith is the problem. This is where a lot of people pin their problems today. I have a problem of faith. I really struggle in my faith and with my faith. Well, I don't think any of those things are what was lacking. It wasn't a problem of desire or power of faith. Those are just surface causes, but there's a root problem. I know the answer, and you can discover the answer too. But here's the thing, while we do our research and dig into it, while we'll discover what was lacking, be careful, because it might challenge you too. Let's look at Joshua's warning. Now, this takes place, this is why I said we're going to go up to 21, but in actuality, even right now, we're going to look at chapter 23. But I don't want to get too deep into his warning, because when we get there, we'll spend more time on it. But I think by taking it into consideration, you'll discover the answer of what was lacking. Let's look at it. Joshua 23 and verse 11 says, "Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves, that you love the Lord your God. Else if you do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you. Know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until ye perish from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. And he uses the idea of the promises of God to them to make sure they understand this promise is also true. If you mess up the promise to get you off the land and that these nations will become snares, well, what's the conditions here? He's warning them about driving these nations out. You've allowed them to live among you. Then you better take heed. You better keep yourself separated from them. It's obvious. We can see he's telling them that don't join yourselves to them. Don't get involved with them. Don't intermarry with them. Don't get involved socially. He tells them very clearly that the mixture will conclude with Israel being polluted. Israel will end up turning their back on God. They will break their covenant, and they will end up becoming the aim of God's anger rather than his grace and mercy. Wow. Now I want you to look at verse 16 of this same chapter, because here's what he says. He says, when you have transgressed the covenant. I don't want to get into the other verses there because we'll get into them later, but here he says this, when you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you. You can see the problem. I can see the problem. One of the problems we can glean from this is the worst of men pollute the best of men. And it's odd that the best of man never seems to do much to change the worst of men. In other words, man's natural depravity that we are all infected with has a tendency to go towards wickedness rather than godliness. If the Spirit of God does not move upon us, regenerate us, witness to us, and then enlighten us and educate us through his word, we're in trouble. Now, this is what Joshua warned against. So we know the whole story. I know, again, that Israel failed to keep God's covenant. He warned them against it, and God kept his promise and dispersed them into the whole wide world and removed them from their inheritance. But of course, I don't want to get into the fact that there's also a promise to restore them at a later date. They were dispersed. They were driven out. So again, what happened? How is it that Israel lost their inheritance? Where was the failure at? This is the answer to what they lacked. What they lacked in this failure, it exposes the failure. And I'm going to give it to you straight up. They did not maintain their first love. Do you remember what Joshua told them? The verse that I gave to you right at the very beginning, but I read it quickly. But it is the first and foundational verse for Israel. Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves that you what? That you love the Lord your God. Everything that happens thereafter is because there is a failure to love the Lord their God. We just had the story of Caleb. And if you remember, the emphasis there was that he fully, wholly followed the Lord. Why is that? I think because he loved the Lord. Now here we have in this the tribes that did not drive out the Jebusites and Canaanites and allowed them to live with them. And so he tells them, take good heed. That means to keep a special watch. In fact, the Hebrew here is watch with abundant force. Watch what? Does he say watch your behavior? Does he say watch very carefully your intermarrying with them? You know what he says? Watch your love for God. It is necessary. He is telling them to keep guard over that precious love to Jehovah, your God. Make sure that you do not love yourself more than you love God. This really is the fortress and the foundation of our faith. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, and with all your soul. Put God first. Love Him. And He's telling them you will remain blessed by Him in the land of your inheritance. You see, the failure is one which begins from the inside. Not on the outside, not in the behavior. That's the fruit of what has gone wrong on the inside. It's the same old story of man and sin. You can look through it and see where one tribe said, well, they allowed them to stay and they made them a tribute. In other words, they became a tax base. They became a low wage source. They could put people almost into slavery in what they were doing, but they paid taxes. They got a profit from them. So was it because of profit? It was a love of money. Was it because they didn't want to fight anymore? There was a love of ease. There was a love of self. Whether it was to make them a tax base or because they were tired of fighting, or whether they saw again, they just didn't want to get that involved, whatever it began as, it started as a defection from the inside. God was no longer number one. He was no longer their first love. It was not a lack of faith. And most of the times, I'm going to get to it in just a minute, but most of the times, our problem is not a lack of faith. It's a lack of love. They believe. How could they not believe? But they didn't love. The later results that we know what happened to them, they're being cast out of the land that they are now inheriting, happens because they'd left their first love. Now, I've just got a few minutes, but I want to make a personal application because I can't help. In fact, I'm sure that you've already been able to make personal application yourself from this story of Israel to yourself. We do not live under the law. Our relationship with God is not based upon our obedience. Not our obedience. It's based upon the obedience of Jesus Christ. It is based upon God imputing His righteousness to us and our sins to Him. But this story, rightly understood, will help you in your walk with the Lord. Where does our failure begin? And I'm going to tell you, it does not begin with a problem of faith. It begins with a problem of love. We've been born again. We've been saved. We've been changed. But when our love is focused more upon us than it is upon God, we have a problem. And that's the original problem that man had. It's still there. The fruit of that focus will show up in some sort of compromise at some time and in some way. But it will always show up. It's a problem. It's not a problem, I should say. It's not a problem of desire or power or faith. Do you remember the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and asked him how could he gain eternal life? Jesus talked to him and showed him that he had one problem. You say, well, yeah, he was too rich. Yeah, but he loved his riches. He loved his possessions more than he loved God, more than he loved Jesus Christ. Men love riches more than they love their own soul. Men are attracted to things and begin to love them, and they will never satisfy. We need to learn how to make the choice of loving God. In 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8, the scripture clearly says, "Beloved, let us love one another. For love is of God. And everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not God, or loveth not, knoweth not God, for God is love." We have a defect. It's the old man. He doesn't love God. He loves self. He loves the riches. He loves the feeling, the emotions. Love has been a problem for a long time. We think things that we love will profit us or satisfy us or improve us. But in fact, those things and that problem of our love needs to be driven out. Love of the wrong things is the problem. We forget that we cannot have two masters, because it says, what does it say? We'll love the one and hate the other. You know, the Bible tells us too, we're to love our enemies. It's tough enough, it seems like, for us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Our problem is that natural heart and the love that we have of self. The natural man loves to sit in the uppermost rooms and in the chief seats that Christ warned about. The old nature, like the Pharisees, loves the greetings and the applause of others. Even though we have been born again and have a new love, we can get sidetracked and we can allow the old man to begin to love other things. Jesus taught that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our minds. Remember, he taught Peter to love the sheep and challenged him to understand what that meant, to love my sheep. I'm going to tell you that if we do not love Christ, then we are doomed. But if Christ is in us, his love will constrain us. The problem is not that we don't believe. The problem is a battle of our love. Jesus spoke to the church at Ephesus and in the book of Revelation. In fact, he spoke to 7 different churches that were there, but it's the church of Ephesus that he said in chapter 2 and verse 4, "Nevertheless," he says, "I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love." And after every rebuke of those churches or commendation, he said, "He who has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches." Listen up. If you're part of a church, do you love Jesus more than these? Are you satisfied with God and your personal relationship with him above all others? Let me ask you this, what do you love? I'll ask another question. Are you satisfied with the lot that God has given to you? He gave it to you in love. He gave it out of love and for your best. Now we'll learn a little bit more about that progress when we get into the inheritance divided part 2 in our next study. It's a challenge. It's a tough application. Make sure that you're in the faith. Amen to that. But look at what you love. Lord bless you.